of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rest. Right now it's time for hemp.
Thank you for taking Time for Hemp. I am your host, Casper Leitch. You are listening to Time for Hemp all around the world on Tumblr, SoundCloud, iTunes, iHeartRadio. Anywhere there is sound found on the internet, we are found around the internet making sound. Please share us with your friends. It's Wednesday, which means my joint host today is Judge Lenny Frieling. How you doing, Your Honor?
I'm doing just great. Boiling water, cooking plums, well, watching my wife do it when I wash out the pots. So the show's about pot. I guess washing out the pots seems to be right on topic.
That reminds me of when I was a kid. My mom used to can tomatoes and occasionally with a canned fruit that we would get fresh around the neighborhood or around the state.
Our pears come from next door. Our tree had 3 pears. The next door neighbor's tree is loaded. Today we are thrilled to have Carol Conzelman, University of Colorado, back with us, and we're going to do a mix of where we left off last time, what's new. And Carol, could you give us the thumbnail of your background, what you're currently doing, to put us in perspective?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, Casper and Lenny. It's such a thrill to be back on the show. I'm an anthropology instructor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I work for the residential academic programs here, the Global Studies and the Sustainability and Social Innovation RAPs, as they're called. And I get to teach on all kinds of cool topics like democracy and globalization and immigration and environmental studies and things like that. But my favorite topic, because it's so interdisciplinary and endlessly fascinating and has applications around the world and across time and cultures, is the anthropology of drugs and drug policy. And so I teach a full semester course for first-year students here at CU Boulder every spring. And I'm also the faculty advisor for the CU Boulder chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And with the fabulous SSD peers here, we organize the annual Cannabis Symposium in April every year. So we're putting together plans for that. We'll certainly have to talk about that as it gets closer. But my focus for my research is in Bolivia, and I started working with Bolivian cocaleros, or coca leaf growers, in almost 20 years ago now. And so that was my entree into the whole world of learning about drug policy and its origins and then manifestations in the U.S. and around the world. And so that's kind of how I come to this topic.
Your school model, your school model is not what we're used to. Students show up in class, hopefully do a little work outside of class, then they go home back to the dorm. But your program's different. Tell our listeners, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So it's a cool model here at CU Boulder. So I mentioned they're called RAPs, Residential Academic Programs. And basically every residence hall is a RAP with a different theme. There are all kinds of themes. There's business and engineering and fine arts and history and language and things like that. So the students who live in that residence hall are, have similar interests, and they get to take one seminar per semester in their first year of college in their own dorm. So they basically pad down the hall in their socks and get to go to class in a small group. The enrollment is capped at 18. So we have the seminar experience in their first year of college, which really doesn't exist until they're in grad school. I mean, CU Boulder, their idea of a senior seminar is 40 people. So to have the chance to take a small seminar with, faculty members from around campus that teach sometimes they're teaching, like, for example, micro and macroeconomics. These are classes that usually have hundreds of students in them. But here they are with the full professor in a class with 18 students. And so it's a really great opportunity to build their confidence, help them be able to use different learning styles in a seminar setting rather than just a lecture or textbook setting. And then we have funding to do special outings and guest speakers. And Judge Frieling has been a guest speaker in my, different classes, but usually the Anthropology of Democracy class a number of times. And so it's just a really unique, interactive kind of model.
And being in your class, being able to chat with your class is, in my opinion, a huge honor. And we're talking about the main campus of the University of Colorado. We're not talking a semi-fake, no credential kind of school. This is the real deal with very, very high admission standards and, frankly, the kind of school where I would hope we would see seminars in an undergrad level with small groups with high-powered people in front of them. We need to get them young. And, well, to me, the 18s to 20s, 23s are still young or getting younger.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, they are, because the public education is getting worse and worse in this country. So they come in with, every year it feels a little bit more disjointed. They just don't have the tools for critical thinking. They're afraid to read. They don't know how to read just a book chapter or an article. They're really intimidated by the process. They don't know what they're looking for. They're afraid to really talk about substantive ideas. They tend to focus on all these superficial facts about things. And one of the things, since we're on the Time for Hemp radio show, I mentioned the cannabis symposium that we organized in the spring. I've built that into my course plan for the drugs and drug policy course. So they actually help organize and volunteer at that event and really get to meet people from around the community, around the Front Range, and even nationally, people that are coming in to speak on that topic. And so, again, that opportunity to really relate to real world events that are going on is really valuable.
And your symposium includes both powerful people in Colorado in this part of the world, as well as nationally and internationally. Fair
That's
statement?
Right. Yeah, and the chancellor, Dr. Phil DeStefano, has been a huge supporter for us. In fact, that's one of the reasons why it became such a big, noteworthy event, is because he got behind it. I invited him the first year to come speak to my students about why he was closing the CU Boulder campus. CU Boulder, as people probably know, if you're listening to this radio show, used to be the Mecca on 4/20, April 20th, to come and have a big smoke out on campus. And the chancellor and the student government were fretting and wringing their hands and trying all these efforts to shut down this event every year. And they did succeed, and they closed campus for 3 years, and in which case they had a heavy police presence, they had checkpoints, they had wrote tickets and gave fines, and honestly, they did succeed in ending the event, for better or for worse, whatever your stance is. But I always felt like it was such a huge lost opportunity. I mean, here we are, a public university, a Research One institution, that we should be able to talk about this topic as if it had legitimate academic merit for discussion from all different angles. And like I said, it's my favorite topic because it's so interdisciplinary. And you can talk about it from so many different angles. And so I invited him to come and speak with my students about why the university was shutting down campus, and what were the issues of concern from the university's standpoint on cannabis use, especially after legalization. And the chancellor, to his great credit, agreed to come. And so that's how it started to become a bigger event. And then we invited him to be the welcome plenary speaker the last 2 years. And I just want to give a shout out that, as you were saying, Lenny, this is a a very serious institution of higher learning. But we have the support of the chancellor in taking cannabis to this next level to treat it like a legitimate academic subject for research and debate.
It strikes me that the 420 protest, while the smokeout has an occupy the building, shut down the school kind of a mentality, it was until you created the symposium, and others have done similar things around the country, maybe not to this extent. It shifted more to the model that was effective to stop a war once, and now we're trying to stop a war again. So you're doing a wonderful thing with the symposium. This is a multidisciplinary with small groups focusing on different subjects, related subjects, with speakers knowledgeable on those subjects. And again, I'm going to shut up here, but what else beyond education, facts, knowledge helps a speaker be a more effective presenter? I think there may be nothing else besides knowing the facts. I want to jump back for a second. You're getting people in your class, and we read this in the papers, where their writing skills, and I would suggest perhaps their reading skills, are not what they were in 1968 when I started college. How are we addressing that? Because if we don't have those fundamentals, how do we take it to the next level?
Oh, boy. Oh, that's a big question. But I think some of the things that you're talking about is relating these sometimes obscure academic concepts to the real world is a key part of that process. And I think the public school model has largely eliminated that kind of critical thinking process from the public education curriculum. And so students are taught to these standardized tests. Something like 6 weeks of their time every year, every school year is devoted to test preparation. And all of the other time-consuming factors that the teachers have to focus on. And there's a lot less time for individualized instruction and for students to just take off on topics of personal interest. And so that's something that I do. I think students also need to be taught how to write. So I'm building that into my curriculum to really show them how to construct an essay. How do you even do research? And so at the Cannabis Symposium was an effort at doing that. Hold on. We need to stop. Can you turn the fan off? And then I need a quiet place. I thought that's even too loud. Sorry, I'm trying to move. I was in a quiet spot, but now I'm not. Okay, sorry, here we're starting again. 5, 4, 3. So my effort at organizing the symposium, and especially as the way that it's integrated into my spring course, is so far and above the best thing that I've ever tried to do at this university. And let me just be clear, I could not have done it by myself without the excellent student activists for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I organized what I called a 420 teach-in in 2014, which was my first effort at engaging students deeply in this topic. And then the next year, I collaborated with the SSDP chapter to organize now what we call the Cannabis Symposium, and they had similar efforts. So combining our efforts here has been really fruitful. But I want to just make a point with what you were saying about what I call the teach-in model, which was developed in the 60s around the Vietnam War protests. And that's exactly what you're saying. It was a way to bring faculty and students together in a forum to debate issues of broad public concern in a way that our elected officials were not adequately doing on their own. And they weren't giving it the attention that they needed. And so this kind of teach-in, which in that time became a national teach-in, and that's my goal. That is my ideal. And if people are interested, I encourage them to get in touch with me somehow. Or
Carol, how would you like them to get in touch with you?
I mean, I think email would be a good way, or Facebook. I don't know if you have an online place that people could find my contact information, but maybe we could list it somewhere. But or just get in touch with SSDP National that could get in touch with us. But my ideal would be to organize, where every April, perhaps on 420, but it doesn't have to be on 420, that we would have cannabis symposia going on college campuses around the country. And we would have live streamed events where people could tap in live for at least the featured keynote speakers, and really get students involved that way, because it's not just an esoteric concept, and a lot of people have themselves or have family members or friends who have suffered from the prohibitionist militarized policies that we have. So anyway, that's my the best way that I know of is to get students even just learning about what's happening. Yesterday in class, I asked them, I said, how many people know what's happening at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota right now? And just dead silence.
I have to interrupt. The Thursday lawn mowing guys just showed up, and I have to take this inside, so we have to go.
Well, I'll go ahead and take a commercial break right here.
Okay.
And then we'll come back and pick up where we left off here at Time for Hemp. Are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. Please share us with your friends.
Serious Seeds is your source for quality cannabis and sativa seeds. Serious Seeds are the creators of legendary strains like AK-47, Bubblegum, Chronic, Cali Mist, and White Russian. The AK-47 is probably the most awarded strain on the planet. The high THC content of AK-47 makes it the perfect medical strain for patients seeking quick pain relief. Cali Mist is an almost pure sativa. Female medical cannabis patients have reported that this strain helps relieve menstrual cramps. Serious Seeds just acquired another Dutch high-quality seed bank, Magus Genetics. From now on, Serious Seeds can offer you even more award-winning strains. The fine folks at Serious Seeds strive to breed the best cannabis genetics that they can find, so patients can rely on the effectiveness of their medicine. Go to SeriousSeeds.com to grow your medicine. That site again is SeriousSeeds.com.
Yeah, get your smoke on is what we encourage you to do. Come out of the closet. Be proud of your use of cannabis. As long as you hide in the closet, you know, it's kind of hard to assert your freedoms and to demand your freedoms when you are cowering in the dark. With that said, I will pass this joint conversation back to my joint host and our joint guest here at Time for Hemp.
Carol, when you talk about the problems with testing and preparing for the testing, I took a look at some of the standardized tests, and I have to tell you, I thought the questions were really good. And had I been able to answer those questions, hopefully I would have, when I was at that school level, I would have been pleased. It seems to me that part of the problem may be that the focus is on taking the test as opposed to the underlying ability to take tests in general. Does that make sense to you? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. I think for sure. I just think what it does is that it undermines the agency of this next generation and their ability to pursue their own interests or even identify their own interests, or be able to find credible sources of information. I mean, it's just such a maelstrom of information going on. And, if you think about how long it took all of us to find good sources, if we want to learn about certain topics, where can you find reliable sources of primary information, primary research, actual reliable data, quantitative and qualitative data. And so that's just part of the process, but also, problem-solving skills. There's a wonderful organization called the Institute for Humane Education. Zoe Weil directs it, and there's a wonderful video if you want to search on Google for Zoe Weil Humane Education, and she's given a number of TED Talks and other presentations about how to foster what she calls solutionaries. And I love that way of thinking, solutionaries. So people who learn how to dig deeply, how to think critically, she has a great presentation where she just takes a red T-shirt and she breaks it down. Like, where did all this material come from? Where is the cotton grown? How are the workers treated in these cotton farms? What about all the dyes? And what happens? What are the environmental impacts of both, the chemicals applied to cotton and the dyes for making the shirt? I mean, on and on. She just breaks it down. So, I mean, that's one way that I like to think about what tools am I giving my students? So it's not just information. And I'm sure the tests have been vetted and probably cover a lot of ground, but I think it's that the confidence and that sense of agency, the ability to act in a variety of ways, and that critical thinking that's most often missing from what I see. And so students have a sense of education where they either feel intimidated by the process, they're not empowered by the process, or they're taught to feel like consumers, that their teachers work for them and they can criticize their instructors for, not teaching them in the way that they want, instead of being empowered to think of themselves as solutionaries themselves.
When we Google solutionaries, that should work. How do we spell Zoe?
ZOE, and then Weil, WEIL, Zoe Weil, the Institute for Humane Education.
Spell her last name, please.
WEIL.
I'm glad I asked. The reason that I'm focusing and the reason that it's popping up in my mind, the issues relating to being able to read, being able to critically read, understand. We're in an election cycle. What I see is every time we get close to an election, the anti-drug, make it all illegal, will save the world kind of thinking comes out. And what I see are repeated efforts, repeated trotting out of old studies with little time to respond, which raises two things in my mind. One, being aware, having read the studies, having thought about the issues. So when somebody says, well, there's a study, and this is literally yesterday's news, there's a study showing that underage usage is way up, and the studies that show it's way down, well, they're just wrong, raises two issues. One, the ongoing awareness, and second, the willingness to click through and look at the study. Mm-hmm. Well, I did that. Turns out the study is 2014, about an hour after recreational was legalized, when what I would call the smart people were saying it hasn't been out there long enough for us to have a clue. And the studies showing reduction in underage use are a year newer, a year and a half newer, 2 years newer. So when I think, can the person read? Can they analytically read? What goes through my mind is the ability to read many of these studies and understand them in a critical way. So when someone trots it out, you can say, well, that's a 2014 study. It's not peer-reviewed. How do we do that if we haven't taught people how to read to begin with, and how to not be afraid of reading something where perhaps they only understand part of it?
That's right. That's right. And I think the other part is sort of that sense of improvement. You know, when I used to teach high school, there was a lot of information they had to know. That's just the way it is. So it's not that just building your knowledge is worthless. Obviously, you need a big foundation in the bottom of your pyramid of good knowledge and comprehension, but also understanding that process, the higher order thinking. So like when I taught high school, they could turn in an exam or a paper, and then they would get feedback, and then they could rewrite it and improve themselves. With standardized testing, you can't do that. I mean, your score is your score. If you had a bad day, if your parents are fighting, or your whatever's going on in your life, can really affect your scores. And then, those scores have just been used to shut down schools that are quote, underperforming. And guess where those schools are, largely in the neighborhoods that need them most. I don't know. I think it's the whole system needs to be reevaluated.
And in fact, we're doing that. We're doing that worldwide.
Yep.
Let's shift focus.
Yep.
I happen to know, because of my inside sources, and oh, by the way, having spoken to you many times, that you have a particular focus and interest in South America and Bolivia. Mm-hmm. And many of our listeners are probably aware that there's great progress being made in Central America, in South America, towards legalization to take the money and power away from what we would call correctly the criminals. Mm-hmm. How are we doing?
Oh my gosh. Well, that gets to the point you were just making about these studies that come out. And if you don't know what the source is, if you don't know who's funding these studies, then you can be really misled as far as what's the actual reality on the ground in these areas. So, a new study that came out by the U.S. government about how much coca leaf is under cultivation in Bolivia. Well, and it's much, the numbers are much higher than the United Nations numbers. So the UNODC, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, puts out their annual statistics, but they're transparent about the methods that they use. And so, but the US study is not transparent. They will not reveal what studies that they use. They say, oh, it's a combination of satellite data and flyovers and stuff. But, they're not willing to subject their research to peer review. It's not reliable.
What is peer review? Why do we keep saying that? Why does that matter?
Well, it's not a perfect process, but peer review just means that other experts in your field can look at your results and help assess whether your methodology and your interpretation and even your hypotheses, the questions you're asking, are valid and to what extent. And that's the idea behind peer review. Now, can peer review be a corrupted process? Yes, it can. You can have somebody on your peer review that has a vendetta against you that might just decide to reject your findings because they don't like you or because they want their research to come out first. Or, there have been some studies to show that, peer review is imperfect, but it's the best process we have to validate academic findings. And so, the problem with government data is that there is an agenda behind it. The status quo and the people who are in elected office have an incentive to maintain their position in office to play the drug war prohibition game, because it's, as we know, it's based on fear and not much based on actual scientific findings and evidence. So that's part of the process. And so that's why in South America, there's a lot of, we're going to go get the bad guy. There's something called the kingpin strategy that was developed as one of the tactics in the drug war, especially in the 70s and 80s, where the cartels were gaining in size and influence and prominence and power. And so Pablo Escobar and now El Chapo from Mexico, this idea that if we just take out the kingpin, the guy at the top, that we are doing grave damage to these cartels and we're winning the war on drugs. Well, those kinds of data, quote data, that, we've taken out this many drug lords. We've interdicted this number of tons of cocaine. We've eradicated this number of coca fields. And in Colombia, that means with Monsanto's glyphosate, which is causing incredible harm to those ecosystems and the people that live there.
And would you tell us what specifically Monsanto product you're referring to and why that matters?
Okay. Let me get to that in 1 second. So
Yes.
That's a whole separate question, because the only place that we carry out fumigation is in Colombia. But all of those numbers, those statistics, Sanho Tree from the Institute for Policy Studies, who's coming to CU Boulder on September 28th, he calls them meaningless metrics. And that's exactly what they are. Because we have these numbers flying around in the media, and they mean nothing. They show no evidence of any progress whatsoever in either stemming the production of drugs, stemming the supply, or reducing consumption. Those are the statistics that the drug warriors like to use because it looks like a big deal. LEAP, as you know, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, has made a big point about this, a big effort at raising awareness around these meaningless metrics. That they have had no impact on any of the so-called objectives of fighting the drug war, of this premise of keeping the public safe and reducing addiction and reducing drug use. So the problem is when you have government statistics of how many hectares of coca leaf, for example, are supposedly under cultivation, that should raise a red flag for people to look at that and say, well, who's saying that? And what's really their their agenda here. Because what you do if you say that certain number of hectares are under cultivation in Colombia, there's no context there. What we see if you look at the fumigation methodology in Colombia. So 30 years ago in the 80s, when this strategy was first undertaken, and the Reagan administration started working with Monsanto. So Monsanto makes, everybody knows about Roundup. Well, Roundup is glyphosate, and that is the chemical that they've manufactured that is an herbicide, kills plants. And so the version that is bought with U.S. Public tax dollars under Plan Colombia, or whatever version is in play over the years with Colombia to try to eradicate coca leaf. So it's something called source country control. And the idea is if we just get rid of the supply of coca leaf, which contains the cocaine alkaloid. Coca leaf is an ancient medicinal plant, has been under cultivation for at least 8,000 years, probably more like 10,000 years in the Andes region, and has had no evidence of any sort of abuse. It's a ceremonial plant. It's the most important medicinal plant in the region. It's also highly nutritional. But the idea, because if we've categorized in 1961, we talked about this in the last show, based on racist grounds, that coca leaf is the cause of poverty in this region. So we've categorized coca leaf together with cocaine as a Schedule I narcotic, which means no proven medical use and the highest possibility for addiction, the highest level of restriction on trade, cultivation, and trade in the world. And so if coca leaf is also bad, but it's also the source of cocaine. So the idea under prohibition is if we can just get rid of the supply of coca leaf, then we're going to somehow reduce the consumption of cocaine in the United States. Well, that premise is completely false, but that is still what our policies are based on. And all it has done is metastasize and atomize the production of coca leaf in Colombia, especially because it went from a relatively restricted area, a smallish area of coca leaf production in one region of Colombia, and now with fumigation throughout the 90s and the 2000s, it has spread to the entire country because. I can go on. I don't know. There's so many things that are related to this issue, but there's something called the balloon effect. And if you take a product that is in high demand and that there's a high profit margin for the production and trafficking of this substance, which there is under the prohibition model, because this is all an underground black market economy where criminal organizations are controlling the production of cocaine and its trafficking, there is an incentive for maintaining its illegal status, because the price that you pay for cocaine on the streets of the United States or Europe or Rio de Janeiro is not related to the cost of the plant. These are minimally processed agricultural products, as Sanho Tree also says. And so the price comes from the risk of that these criminal elements take to traffic them and manufacture the cocaine. So by reducing the supply of coca leaf, what are you doing? You are only helping to raise the price of that product and provide even more of an incentive for criminal elements to get involved and make massive profits on the black market. And what you're doing with glyphosate then, by using this chemical, is not only maintaining and augmenting the supply of this product and of the drug itself, of cocaine, but you're causing irreparable environmental harm. We're scorching the lungs of the earth in Colombia. It's the second most biodiverse nation in the world. And because this, people, the farmers who produce it are impoverished, desperate to survive, there's no state services in these regions. And so they will continue, they will replant. And so we are just going deeper and deeper into the rainforest as we fumigate and replant, fumigate and replant, fumigate and replant. And so this is all by way of saying that this methodology has completely failed. But if you look at the statistics that the U.S. government is putting out on this process, they will say not only, is there this coca leaf production is increasing. Yes, because of your methods, which they don't say. Oh, we've eradicated X number of hectares of coca leaf. Okay, yes, but that does nothing to stem the production or the supply. Oh, we've taken down these kingpins. We've captured El Chapo. We've arrested all of these gang members or cartel leaders. Yeah, but what you're doing is you're just creating a power vacuum that will be filled through a violent process, and you will just replicate the process. So that's what LEAP is trying to build awareness around. That's what a lot of different organizations are trying to show, that those statistics that come out are meaningless metrics, and we have to get much better information to guide us in our policy reforms.
It strikes me and always gets my attention that when we fire El Chapo, when we fire Pablo Escobar, what people think of as downsizing, which theoretically might be an effective strategy, what we have instead is just job changing. The seat doesn't go unfilled.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, the cartels, our kingpin strategy has served not only to increase the violence, but also to atomize the cartels themselves. So instead of 2 or 3 very large organizations, top-down organizations, they have also, as a survival strategy, they have diversified. So we have dozens and dozens now of different cartels at all different scales. And then we've just created this, much more violent setting where, a lot of the community members in these areas are being literally caught in the crossfire. And communities around Colombia, and as we know now in Mexico, we've created the largest refugee crisis outside of actual war zones like Iraq and Syria, in Colombia and in Mexico, because these criminal organizations use terrorist tactics to intimidate communities so that they're not going to inform on drug production or trafficking operations going on, but they are highly paranoid, and they will assassinate community leaders and religious leaders and indigenous shamans and all kinds of, business owners to shut them up, and totally corrupted the political process as well. So what we're seeing in Colombia right now, the historic agreement between the FARC, one of the biggest organization of armed rebels that became involved in the cocaine trade, and their peace agreement with the government of Colombia that was negotiated in Havana over 2 years or something like that. And the FARC leaders have asked all of their operatives to lay down their arms and stop fighting against the state. I mean, partly Colombia is a very different situation because they've had a civil war ongoing for 45 years. So it remains to be seen whether this peace agreement will be long-lasting and what the ramifications will be. But the state really needs to step up and not just be this repressive force where the only way that people experience the government is through helicopter gunships and toxic fumigation that's poisoning their water supplies and their legal crops, their kitchen gardens, their communities, and causing birth defects and horrible epidemics. That the state actually becomes a different presence in their lives to actually build infrastructure and provide public services in places that have never had a state presence outside of repressive, militarized tactics. So they're being accosted on all sides by their own government and these criminal gangs. So, the next step is to figure out how to help Mexico, because the refugee crisis that we're seeing at our borders is not just people, coming to America to find a better life, and they're not willing to work hard in their country. They just want to come here and take our jobs. Nothing could be further from the truth. These people are fleeing a humanitarian crisis in Mexico, and I should say in Honduras and in Central America. And it's largely caused by by our drug prohibitionist, militarized drug policies. We are allowing weapons to flood across our border into Mexico and Central America, and our neoliberalist policies that are promoting privatization and access to resource above any sort of human rights or indigenous rights is the direct contributor to this refugee crisis. And so we can no longer look at drug policy as being separate from free trade policies like NAFTA and CAFTA and the strong-armed U.S. presence in Central America that has done things like back a violent coup in Honduras that has ousted a democratically elected president and led to a militarized state that is intimidating and assassinating indigenous activists like Berta Cáceres 6 months ago.
Well, I know it sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple. I have this great idea. All we have to do to solve the refugee crisis is build a really big wall.
Right. You and Trump.
Along the border, just like what worked so well in Berlin.
It's
wait a minute. We tore that down.
Right. Because it was a human rights abomination. And it did nothing to address the concerns of these people who are literally should be treated as refugees. They should be given asylum. And we don't look at the context. We don't look at the causes. Why are there people there? We just have this demonization, this punitive, dehumanizing mindset towards these people. I mean, now we have the private prison industry along the border that is incarcerating women and children and men and entire families in this prison system, treated like crap, and people are on hunger strike. I mean, yeah, we need a more holistic approach to these issues. So going back to understand the origins of drug prohibition, the racist origins, as we talked about, the racist manifestations, who are the people being targeted by these policies, and then the way that people are being impacted in other countries. We do not see that even though we love to call ourselves the world's greatest experiment in democracy, first of all, that's not necessarily true. It's been a really worthwhile experiment, but our U.S. foreign policy is not democratic. And the impact that we've had on people, the people with the least say and the least power within the system, of the least ability to impact these policies, are suffering the worst consequences.
Carol, switching directions just a little bit, do you have a sense of the pulse of the part of the student body that you deal with on their attitude towards the war on drugs? And by the way, as we know, it's not a war on drugs, it's a war on people.
That's right.
What's your sense of the pulse of the student body?
Good question. It's definitely improved over the years. There are a lot more people who have access to information and have had experience with, different substances. I think drug use has gone up markedly, but it's a different kind of drug use than what we might talk about, from the 60s and 70s, where kids were smoking pot and dropping acid. Now we have that going on, but the hard drugs are pervasive. Heroin is around in these dorms. I mean, drugs are saturating the residence hall, not just at CU Boulder, but around the country. but combine those with pharmaceuticals. And that's the real danger that I see. You have students who are on different medications or who are getting it from their friends, different anti-anxiety medications, obviously, Ritalin type medications, but also sleeping pills like Ambien. And kids are combining those with hard drugs, sometimes hard drugs, or even pot and alcohol. And so that's really the problem that I see. Sexual assault is definitely pervasive and seriously problematic. We need to get a grip on that. So, but I would say the majority have been raised in the just say no mentality. And so there's very little access, again, to reliable information. And that's why I love this topic, because it teaches, if students realize that they are being fed a lot of propaganda, but you teach them how to access reliable information in this one area that they're really interested in. Drugs is something that even students who are teetotalers are still interested in the topic. It's still kind of fascinating from a voyeuristic standpoint, maybe. But, then they realize that there's a lot of propaganda they're being fed, and they need to learn how to look behind the scenes and really dig a little bit deeper to access reliable information, not just because of a policy standpoint, because a lot of people are being murdered in Mexico. That may be a motivation for some students, but for others, it's, how do I stay safe? How do I keep myself safe? How do I keep my family and my parents even, and my friends safe? And that's why this issue of drugs is so much bigger. But a lot of students have had family members that have spent time in prison or who have committed suicide because of addiction. Every single student, every time I have a speaker that talks about addiction, and he asks them to say how many people know someone, a friend or family member who committed suicide, every single hand goes up. Every single hand in class. So we're dealing with a social crisis that's going on all around us, and our students are really suffering from this, either their own addictions or that of a loved one. So it's a topic that brings that out and really helps empower them to make changes in their own lives and then also in their own careers.
Well, we need to make some changes here because we are down to the end of the hour and it's time to wrap it up, which means it's time to put a spotlight on our favorite URL, and we'll start with our remarkable guest, Carol.
I would just highlight SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, ssdp.org. They are a national and an international organization. They have chapters on college campuses all around the country, and they get involved. They respond to volunteer initiatives and to organize on campuses and also in Washington, D.C.
And Your Honor?
I have to echo that. Of all the organizations I've worked with, and as you know, I've held many positions in normal, NORML.org. I'm a LEAP speaker, etc., etc. I have not been as impressed with any organization more than I have been with SSDP.org. These students are astonishing. I gave a speech a number of years ago for SSDP down at University of Denver. They were out stapling paper to phone posts, and they got hundreds of people into the room. And as we all know, it is not easy to get hundreds of people into a room. Leap.cc, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Oversimplified, ex-narcotics officers that realized the error of their ways and have now come out and said, we really need to legalize and regulate all of these drugs. We don't want to give random death penalties to heroin addicts because the batch is too strong. And we're dealing that within the country right now. We're tracking down a strong batch that is killing people in 5 states right now. And, of course, normal, NORML.org. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Casper.
And I want to remind people that we are a group of activists who are dedicated to ending prohibition all around the world. And we ask that you help us raise our voice by going to our website and checking out all the free MP3s you can download and share with your friends. And remember, the next time you hear me, you'll know that it's time for hemp.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spend. Take another look and spend some time for hemp. Don't cut trees for paper, 'cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yes.
You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. Please share us with your friends.